events. On Friday, we have a talk by Laura Gladowski, our postdoctoral fellow, one of the postdoctoral fellows this year, on expectation and exception, expertise as an epistemic constraint. It's at noon on Friday. You're all invited, of course. And on Tuesday next week, we have the last event of the semester, which is a debate between Dan Bernstein and Wen Wu. Dan, who is right here, a visiting fellow at the center of the semester. And the topic will be intention and agency in mind and brain. It's going to be 20 minutes. Each will expose their position, and then each will have 10 minutes for response, and then half an hour for Q&A.
And what, is that in person?
It is in person. That's the first time it's going to be happening in person, so we'll see how that works.
Maybe the last time.
Maybe the last time. It will be here in this room. We need to find a way to organize the room. All right. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce Brice Bantegnie, who is a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at the University of Riverside, I guess, with Jerry Fodor. Is that right? With Jerry Fodor, and also the Department of Philosophy at the University of Southampton. He got his PhD at the École Normale Supérieure in France and at the Jean Nicot Institute in Paris, which is part of the École Normale Supérieure. And his advisor was Roberto Casati, and I was delighted to recognize my own former advisor in the committee, Daniel Andler, who was my advisor. So there's a connection. Brice works in the philosophy of psychology and neuroscience, and has published papers in excellent journals such as Erkenntnis and Inquiry. Brice, the floor is yours. I guess you don't have a PowerPoint.
No, I don't.
It's the first time this year, so something new.
Yeah,
go for it. Floor is yours.
It's a first.
One more thing before. Sorry. Brice will be here for the whole day today, and maybe tomorrow morning as well. But that is for the whole day today. If you want to talk to him about his research interest, feel free to reach out after the talk. Meeting with him. Floor is yours. Sorry for interrupting.
Okay, no. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks to also Chantal, Samuel, and also Jennifer for their work in organizing. So my research project is about developing the consequences for the philosophy of mind and also the philosophy of cognitive science of the view that I take to be a platitude that mental states are states of people are in. And the idea is that it could help integrate some two different ways of seeing the mind, like more epistemology oriented, and which might be represented by the philosophy department at Pitt, and more which is more cognitive science oriented, which might be represented by the HPS department at Pitt. And so this is part of the project, and this is more in the philosophy of cognitive science side. Okay, so where the philosophy of cognitive science went wrong. So it's a very catchy title. I hope I will be able to explain what I mean by that. So philosophy of cognitive science can mean a variety of things. So three different things might be, it's a philosophy of cognitive science, as there is a philosophy of physics, for example, in the sense that you investigate the kind of explanation, the kind of predictions, the kind of theory that cognitive science put forward. You might also think that philosophy of cognitive science is theoretical cognitive science, for example. And you might also say that cognitive science is like cognitive science-inspired philosophy of mind, whatever that is. And here in the talk, I mean only it in the sense of like philosophy of cognitive science, and also theoretical cognitive science, if I may say. So the title is a nod to Fodor, as you might have guessed, and the idea is to say, broadly speaking, that Fodorian philosophy of cognitive science is wrong, and this is yay. And so you might think that everyone knows that, because when you say that like something is a paradigm, you always find people to say, no, this is not the case. Everyone believes that this is all false. So you don't have to agree with Fodor to think that he put forward a program that is mostly the one that we are with today. So obviously, fortunately, you don't have to agree with Fodor for that, because Fodor, as you know, put forward a lot of controversial theses. But the idea is just that he set to philosophy of cognitive science some goals, and also, more importantly, some methodological assumptions that are still with us today, even if you disagree with Fodor a lot on the specifics. So if you don't think that it's actually a dominant paradigm, you can take me to argue for some kind of conditional claim, like if you think that if Fodorian philosophy of cognitive science, in the sense I will make clear, is important, then blah, blah, blah. This follows, okay? So what do I have in mind by Fodorian philosophy of cognitive science? So there is a framework. The goals are twofold. So the first goal is explaining of cognitive capacities computationally. And the second goal is vindicating false psychology. And vindicating false psychology might be the contentious one, though again, I think that it's mostly the case. Even if you don't share Fodor's apocalyptic beliefs about what would happen if false psychology was false, you might agree with like the broad picture that we should try to do that in any case. The methodological principles, I take it, are that Fodor's appeal to introspection in characterizing our cognitive capacities. And the second one is that he looks at the explanatory role of mental states, the explanatory roles of beliefs and desires and hopes and everything. So I don't take it that these views are explicitly put forward by Fodor, these methodological principles. I just take it that these are the principles that make the more sense of the way he usually proceeds. And these principle leads him to put forward his specific views about the language of mind, the language of thought, and the way the language of thoughts vindicates folk psychology. The language of thought is plagued with specific problems. So the problems of accounting for example, the creativity, or the fact that when you think, you appeal to a lot of your beliefs at the same time, which he calls the isotropy of thought. And as for the vindication of false psychology, there is the problem of the epiphenomenality of content. It's something with which Fodor struggled during his whole career.
Could you just possibly please clarify what false psychology is? Is it experimental psychology from all different species? Or what is it for Fodor, please?
False psychology is like the psychological lore of people. Okay. So some people...
I heard false.
Folk.
Okay.
Oh, sorry about that. Vindicated false psychology would be a hard task. You could try to do so. I take it that Fodor's methodological assumptions stem from an ontological presuppositions that mental states are these mental particulars, so that introspection gives you some kind of specific access to them. And also that they have this explanatory role because they are these hidden entities, like they have a theoretical character. And in the paper, I want to show how if you switch your ontological, if you replace this ontological assumption by the platitude that mental states are states people are in, you get to a much more skeptical picture of much more skeptical positions on the language of thought. It's very unclear that he does any work, that there is any work to do. In contrary to what Fodor thought. And if there is no such work to be done, then the specific problems which arise for Fodor just disappear because they are created by this postulation that there is such a thing as a language of thought. Okay, so Fodor's view, so that this is the first part of the paper, just for those of you who are not very familiar, I will just quickly lay out the views he defended, and in the next section I will spell out like the problem that this created, and in the third section I will briefly make more clear what these ontological assumptions are, that mental states are mental particulars, and that they are states people are in. And in the last one, we'll see how it should lead us to have a very skeptical point of view about language of thought. So I don't take it that my arguments are demonstrative, that I will really convince you of that. I just want to instill of you skepticism about that, and to show how these an alternative view is much more promising when it comes to meeting the goals that Fodor set to himself and to the discipline, as I said at the beginning. So Fodor has two main views that I happily share, and one is to explain the cognitive capacities we have computationally. And so the view here is the view that what underlie our having these very capacities is the manipulations of sentences in the language of thought. So speaking of the language of thought is a metaphorical view, partly metaphorical view, I guess, to say that you have mental representations which are mental particular, internal particulars, that have some kind of syntax and also semantics. And so when you have a thought, this thought has constituents, and this constituency relation is a part-whole relation, and it's also a co-tokening relations. It's important for what comes afterwards. So if I have a thought, I token the thought, and the thought is token, the mental representation is mental particular is token, and also the part of the mental particulars are token. Okay. So that's sometimes called the computational theory of mind, or you can say the classical computational theory of mind, because you can also be connectionist of sorts and say that you also put forward a computational theory of mind, albeit now a classical one. It's not a symbolic computational theory. What are Fodor's arguments for this thesis? Well, he argued for the thesis on the basis of two features that he thinks thoughts have. Thoughts are productive, it's on the handout, and they're systematic. So the productivity is supposed to, so you can use language to get a handle, better handle of what it means. Productivity means that you can generate from the constituents, you can generate a whole lot of thoughts just by adding constituents or rearranging them. And for example, if I think that, I don't know, the uncle of my friend is, I don't know, lives in Pennsylvania, I can say the uncle of my friend, of the friend of my neighbor, and I can go on for ages. And this gives you a thought that no one ever before me has thought about. And what is systematicity? And it will be the most important feature for later. Systematicity is, Fodor and McLaughlin tell us, that thoughts come in clumps. Okay, that's a quote. their joint paper. So if I had thought that, I don't know, for example, John loves the girl, that's one of their examples. You also have the thought that the girl, you can have the thought that the girl loves John. So there is a connection, an intrinsic connection, as it's sometimes found in the literature, between having one thought and having the other. And this connection is a matter of psychological law. Again, I quote Fodor and McLaughlin here. So it's a nomological truth that when you have one thought, then you can have the other. And it's not only that there is an intrinsic connection, it's also that it's systematic in the way that the thoughts are semantically connected, the thoughts are semantically connected, but it's systematic in the way that it's it mirrors the syntactic connections between the sentences in the language of thought. So if I have the thought that John loves the girl, I have the thought that the girl loves John, and you see that the object in the first thought is the subject of the second one, and reciprocally. It's important to note that systematicity is systematicity enough, in the way that you don't need to take Fodor to be committed that there is whole complete systematicity of thought, in the way there is a systematicity of language, for example. So you don't need to think that if you are able to think one thought, then you are able to think the passive form of the thought, for example. So if I think that John loves a girl, I don't necessarily take Fodor to be committed to say that you also have the capacity to think the passive form that the girl is loved by John. If you take Fodor to think that you would think that it's immediately refuted by the literature in psychology, which shows, for example, that children have a hard time with passive, for example. So how does language of thought explain the systematicity? The productivity is usually has been abandoned mostly by Fodor because it leads us to ascribe the capacity to entertain infinite or at least very long thought, and it doesn't seem psychologically realistic. So it's mostly the focus for Fodor is on systematicity. So the idea is simple. You have sentences in the language of thought. They have a syntax. Okay. So the systematicity just comes out of the fact that it's a language of thought. When you have one sentence and you token one sentence in the language of thought, then the constituents are also tokened. That's what I just said. They are co-tokened. The constituents are tokened, and so you can easily rearrange them to have the other thought that is taken to be systematically related to the first one. So that's a classical computational theory of mind. And the second goal is to vindicate thought psychology. And here the idea is, well, you have sentences in the language of thought, and what it is to have a thought is just to be related to these sentences in the language of thought. So you're related to these sentences, and that's what makes it through your ascriptions of thought to people. If I say that, I don't know, Edward believes that it's lunchtime, what I'm saying is that he is talking in a sentence in the language of thought, which has the content, it is lunchtime. And he's related to this sentence in a specific way that can be cashed out functionally, which is the way people are related to the sentence of thought when they believe that something is the case. Therefore, thought psychology is true, and the apocalypse is not for today, it will maybe later. Okay, so these are the views, and this is, by the way, the representational theory of mind. So you can have a sorry, I have a hard time with this. Representationalist theory of mind, even if you don't go for a computational theory of mind, because people didn't wait for computers to be discovered to have this idea that you had sentences in the language of thought, and that had a specific content, and that's what explained and what justified our ascriptions to thought to each other, of thoughts to each other. So these two views can be separated, and you can go for a computational theory of mind, even if you don't believe these views about mental state subscriptions at all. So this is the first part. And the second part, this brings out a number of problems, and they have a specific form in Fodor's writings, but they can have a more general. You can spell them out in a more general form, which is related to his methodological assumptions. So if you want to explain cognition computationally, for example, one of the problems you can encounter is that higher cognition is not local. That's one way to put what Fodor means when he said that thought is isotropic. When you have a thought, what explains why you have this thought can appeal to any mental state that you can have, any of these mental states. And the problem for that is that computation for Fodor is local, which means that your mental representations are stored in a specific place, and they can only interact with a limited number of other mental representations. So you're going to have trouble explaining why you can appeal to any mental states, any beliefs, let's say, that you have to decide that something is the case, to judge that something is the case, if you think that what explains this capacity is the tokening of sentences in the language of thought. It might not be a completely hopeless problem, but it's a serious problem anyway. Now this is a special problem, and you can have a more general problem, which is related to this fact that Fodor bases his views mostly on introspection. At least it's the way I interpret him. Because you can think that there are many other things that will cause problem for this language, this classical computational theory of mind. For example, creativity. It's unclear how you will explain creativity if you have this very local view of what a computation is. So you can have a feature X and think that computation don't have this feature, and then you have the problem of explaining what makes it the case that our cognition has this feature. For example, the creativity of our cognition. So that's one problem, which is tied to the first methodological assumption, which is that you appeal to introspection to determine the capacities that we have. And the other problem is the idea that, which is tied to the view that mental states are explanatory posits. So if you look at the representational theory of mind, you realize that it's unclear what the semantic content of the sentences in the language of thought, what role they play. It's unclear. And it's an issue because when we ascribe mental states to each other, these mental states usually will have content. So you end up with the problem of trying to vindicate our mental states ascription, which ascribe content to the thoughts of other people, by using a theory which doesn't make an essential use of the content of the mental representations. So if you can dispense yourself of the content of appealing to the content of mental representations when you explain what makes it the case that someone has a belief, for example, it's unclear how our thought ascriptions are justified. And again, you can think that there are more general issues that can be generated on the same basis. You can think that there are some features of thought that folk psychology commits us to, and that these features of thought are not shared by the mental representations. For example, you can think that connected to the content of the thoughts, there is some kind of normative statutes that are for our thoughts, that there is some kind of obligation that you have to have some kind of belief at some point, and if you want to explain what makes it the case, and this is so, then it's unclear that you can do that by appealing to sentences in the language of thought. Okay. Okay, 15. 25 minutes left, if I'm not mistaken.
About, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So just to move to the third part, in this idea that there is ontological presupposition. The presupposition that mental states are internal particulars. So this is the view, I take it, that is the view which is adopted by an overwhelming majority of philosophers of mind and cognitive science. And the idea, I hope, is clear enough. That is, your mental states are somewhere in there. And it's unclear it's not easy to make sense of it when you look at this presupposition without having some kind of metaphysical picture. But if you're a physicalist, suddenly things get clearer. So the idea is that mental states are just like states of your brain, for example, parts of your brain are located somewhere. Or if they are not located somewhere, if they are distributed in the brain, at least they have this characteristic that they are state of your brain, as I was just saying, not necessarily parts of your brain, states of parts of your brain, but states of your brain. And if you go for this view, then it seems indeed that to some extent, you can have some kind of introspective access to them. So either you think that you have some kind of special relationship with this part of you that is your mental state, or if you think in physicalist term, you think that, well, the brain state is in there, and you have some kind of mechanisms that the brain has some kind of there are some connections that relate some special location in the brain to the location in the brain when there is this mental state that explain why you can actually say in which mental states you are in. And if you go for this, it's also sensible to think that mental states are explanatory posits, because the idea is that these are unobservable things, but you can still observe them to some extent if you just look at an image of your brain, for example, and you point your finger at the spot in your brain and say, oh, this is where my belief here. So this is a story, obviously, and a very simplified story, mostly for bedtime, but that's the idea that underlies this picture. Now, if you get rid of this presupposition, well, you can put something in its place, and it's the platitude that mental states are states people are in. Now, if you do that, what you're saying is that mental states are properties people have Or you might have a more complicated picture and say, for example, mental states are events in which people are involved, and these events are grounded by you having a specific property. Okay, I mean, the ontological picture is not necessarily, it doesn't make much of a difference in this context, but you can have different views about what mental states are exactly, and what makes it the case that when you have a mental state, you have it. Now, if you go for this view, then you end up with two different methodological principles. Or at least that's the best way to say it. Again, my agreement here is not supposed to be demonstrative. I think, be able to put forward a full argument for this, but not in such a limited amount of time. So the first thing is that the option is to appeal to introspection is deeply problematic. It's unclear exactly why you would have this specific access to your mental states, if they are events that you're involved in or properties that you are having. It's not barred from the beginning, but it's something that takes some arguing. So then it becomes much more sensible from a methodological point of view to individuate your capacities behaviorally, to appeal to the kind of actions you perform in some specific context to determine whether you have the mental capacity that you're claiming you have. And the second methodological principle is also problematic from this point of view. Well, right, if you don't have this picture of mental states as internal particular, it's unclear why you would insist that they are explanatory posits. It's a much more sensible view to say that there are explananda, things that you should explain. What makes it the case that you have a belief in the situation? And how do you explain that? Well, you give a theoretical model of the kind of things that underlie your having this belief. And D2 for desires and other mental states. Mental states are on the par with many other things that no one ever wondered, no one ever hoped to cash out in terms of internal particular, like, for example, character traits or skills, habits. When you want to explain these things, you appeal to some theoretical explanation of what makes it the case that you have these traits, this habit, these skills, and the view here is you should do the same when it comes to mental states. What makes it the case that you have this belief? You can have a complicated mental architecture which say why you have this belief. You don't need to have this picture that your belief is just one mental representation to which you're related, and that's the story. Okay. So, last part. Let's take a look at the arguments that Fodor gives for systematicity to see whether it vindicates the language of thought view, and also to his argument that it's problematic to vindicate thought psychology by appealing to mental representation, for example. Whatever they are. Okay, they can be distributed or not distributed. So, obviously, when Fodor talks about systematicity, he's talking about a competence that you're having, not about performance. So, he's not saying, like, if you have a thought, then you also have the other one, obviously, right? He's saying that, because that would be absurd, he's saying that if you have a thought, you have the ability to have the other one, which is systematically related to the first one. What kind of argument does it give for that? Again, I think he's mostly basing his views on introspection, but he does talk about the systematicity of language. He wants to say, at least at the beginning, though, to some extent, he let this go later, but he wants to say that the systematicity of thought is related to the systematicity, of thought is related to the systematicity of language. But this is unclear, right? So if the idea is that to understand a sentence in language, you have to understand the thought that it's supposed to be expressing, it's unclear that's the case, right? You can have a different theory of meaning, a different view of language, of understanding what it is to understand a sentence that doesn't necessarily lead you to think that you have this very explicit representation of what the content of the sentence is. And moreover, language is about knowing rules. So if you want to go deeper in at least that's one way to put it, if you want to go deeper into the theoretical explanation, you realize that these rules have to be represented, maybe, but it's unclear that this representation has to be necessarily a representation in a language of thought, right? So you have this picture of language based on some kind of capacity, some kind of skill that you have of using language, and you have the theoretical explanation that in some sense you can represent the rules, but it's unclear that it's committed to anything like a language of thought. So that's one thing. Another thing is that it's not an argument, but it's something that I want to put forward because it helps us get clearer on what systematicity is. Fodor and Mentlofley at some point tie systematicity to learning, and they say you don't find organisms that can learn to prefer the green triangle to the red square, but can't learn to prefer the red triangle to the green square. But this is not the issue, right? So I want just to make clear, it's not about learning. Obviously, if you don't think that thoughts are systematic, there is no reason why you would oppose the claim that if you are about to learn to prefer the green triangle, you're not ipso facto able to learn to prefer the red square. I messed up the example, but you get the point. Obviously, it's not about learning things because you have lots of things that happened between the thought and you learning the content of the thought. It's about the thought itself. It's about the occurrent thought that you are having. And the idea is if you have this occurrent thought, you have the ability to think the systematically related thought. Okay. So the question is, how do we understand this idea that thoughts are nomologically connected? That having a thought is nomologically connected to our ability to have another thought. But here, I invite you to stop a moment and realize how complicated this is to assess, right? Because we are talking about a nomological connection between something and something which has a modal nature. So if you have an easy time wrapping your head around this, I don't. So what it is that what is this ability that we are talking about? This thing that has a modal character. And Fodor never bothers explaining, neither like everyone in the literature, as far as I know. So what are these abilities exactly? What is their nature? Well, to start with, thinking doesn't seem to be an ability. Having a thought, an occurrent thought, doesn't seem to be an ability. Or having the ability, this modal thing, this thing that has a modal nature doesn't seem to be an ability because there are views about abilities, and these views are usually abilities to do things, right? The ability to ride a bike, and you have this general ability when if I present you a bike, you can ride it, or you have a special ability that can be that you don't have if there is no bike around, for example. There are views about abilities, but this is not the kind of thing that apply to thoughts. Arguably, having a thought is not something that we do, having an occurrent thought. So what are these capacities, if I can use another word for lack of a better one? I think that Fodor and Pilechin make use of introspection here. If you give me the sentence, Anna loves Farid, for example, and you tell me, okay, think that. No, can you think the systematically related thought? Okay, so wait a minute, I'm going to do it. Yeah, I can, because I use language. I just shifted around. I put the object at the location where the subject was, and I put the subject where the object was, and boom, I have the systematically related thought. And first, it's not that easy to do. I mean, if you have tried to teach syntax to middle schoolers, like I had, you will realize that they're not that good at shifting arguments around in sentences. But second, I mean, it's when you do that, you obviously use language, right, to generate the thought. So of course, you have the introspectively, you're pretty sure that when you have a thought, you have the ability to think the other one, because you can just move arguments around in a speech, and you can do it. I mean, nothing is easier than that, at least when you are grown up and you have some education. So then, if you want to determine what these abilities are, it's unclear, or these capacities are, it's unclear. There are not propensities either, right? Because you can have a propensity to think a thought on the basis of another one, but if you tell me Anna loves Farid, for example, I have a propensity to think a lot of other thoughts. For example, in the French context, I will think, this is statistically unlikely, because Farid is a name from a North African background, and these North African, if you come from a North African background, you're usually living in specific location in the suburbs of big cities, for example. If you do so, given the geographical segregation in France, you're not that likely to run into an Anna. It's not very likely that she would have a crush on you. So I have a lot of different thoughts about what is sociologically, historically, what France is and how. But these thoughts are not systematically related to the first one, right? In the way Fodor means. So I do have a propensity to think a lot of other thoughts when I think about the thought Anna loves Farid, but these are not systematically related to the first one. So these are not abilities, these are not propensities. I'm not sure what they are exactly. So it doesn't seem that it's something that comes from myself. It doesn't seem that it's something that I do. It doesn't seem to be something that comes from myself in the sense that it's something that comes about at some point, a propensity. So it's something else, maybe task-driven. In some context, when I have a task to do, then these capacities, with the capacity that I have to think the thought that is systematically related to the first one, will be actualized, okay? Well, will it though? I mean, think about, I don't know, spatial navigation. I want to go to some location, and I think the thought that the location 1 is north of location 2. Do I have the ability, or do I have this capacity to think the thought that location 2 is north of location 1? Well, I mean, if you know some science which is relevant to that, I'd be happy to know about it, because it's not immediately clear to me what, there's nothing that comes to mind. And it's unclear that it's actually true. What you see here is that the systematicity of thought is related to a form of exploration of logical space. You can shift arguments around in your thoughts, and that's what makes it possible for you to think of other solutions for the kind of task that you should be performing. And if that's the case, it's really unclear that thought is systematic. because we're not that good at mapping logical space. If you think about the systematicity of thinking, for example, not of thought, but of thinking, you think that you can generalize the modus ponens, for example, for a whole lot of different contents. It's not clear either, because they are clear, well, at least some evidence, even if it's disputed, that this kind of inferences is specific to the kind of content that you can entertain. And that's not all. That's not all, because so that's the side of the explananda. But if you go to the side of the explanantia, like if you look at that and you think about what Fodor is saying, it's clear that it's a good explanation, because think about it. Fodor says, if you have the sentence in the language of thought, the constituents are co-token. Okay, fine. So you have the constituents, and how do you put them together exactly? Is it automatic? Like immediately you have something in your head that, put the constituents, shuffles them around, and just bring them together, and bing, you have it. It's unclear that it is. In fact, it shouldn't be. There's no reason why it would. It would be automatic. But if that's the case, it's very unclear how it's such a good explanation. It's such a good subpersonal explanation to say, hey, look, you have these sentences in the language of thought, and the constituents are co-token, boom, ergo, you have the capacity to think the systematically related thought. Well, again, it hinges on what this capacity is supposed to be exactly. What is the modal content of this claim exactly? I've tried to spell it out, and I remain very skeptical of the fact that thoughts are systematic in any sense that is advantageous for Fodor in the course of putting forward his argument. If you can do better than me on this, I would be happy to know, really, genuinely. Okay, last thing, vindicating thought psychology, 5 minutes. Okay, I can do that. So Fodor says, you have sentences in the language of thought, you're related to them. Boom, thought psychology is true. Well, and if you don't have this view that there are sentences in the language of thought, it's false. Or at least that mostly it's better understood if you couple this with the computational theory of mind, because they form a nice package. But still. And here I think that Fodor is mistaken. If you have these views and mental states are properties people are in, and if you have these views that as a consequence explaining what makes it the case that people are in these states, then there is no good sense in which if you can't locate the beliefs in your head, if you can't say that there are these mental representation, internal mental representation, then false psychology is false. Again, take the example of character traits, personal level things people have. You have a character trait, for example. You don't need to find character traits in your brain to vindicate your false psychology when you describe your character traits. Well, then why would you need to find mental states in your head or in your brain, if you're a physicalist, to vindicate false psychology when we ascribe each other mental states? There could be a very complicated story about what explains why we have these states. It's unclear it should mention anything like sentences in the language of thought. Now, I'm not saying that false psychology is necessarily true, but what will make it the case that it's false or true is not your theoretical views about what makes it the case that you have beliefs of desire, for example, is the kind of generalization that for scientists, cognitive scientists, find out, and whether they mirror or at least are sufficiently similar to the kind of generalization that we make on the basis of false psychology. Maybe you will think that the kind of views that are defended by Mandelbaum, for example, according to which when we have a belief, we automatically have it. We don't come to a decision, then we don't examine the proposition and then come to a decision, and then we have a belief. Explicitly contradicts false psychology, and if so, then you will think that false psychology is false, not because of some theoretical story, just because of the kind of regularities that psychologists have unearthed. Okay, so then, in the end, conclusion, there are a number of views Fodor has defended. Computational theory of mind, and the representational theory of mind, both are grounded in the existence of the language of thought. And I take it that this is at the origin of the problem that he had, and that these views rest on methodological assumptions, and that these methodological assumptions are grounded in an ontological presupposition that is shared by many. Again, an overwhelming majority of people, and that these ontological assumptions would be better replaced by a platitude that shows that the language of thought picture is not vindicated. Thank you.
All right, we'll take a 2-minute break, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions.